Hi, I'm Jack Porter. I've got the series Jack's Tea Party. This is a history of the U.S. and it helps explain, from my point of view, the history of the U.S. explains a lot about why this country is the way it is in so many ways. Let me draw the United States. A lot of people think that this is a fish when I draw it this way, but that'll be the U.S. So the beginning of the U.S. started with Jamestown and the Pilgrims up in New England. And they eventually came up to about, actually exactly 13 colonies. Georgia was the last colony to join the original 13. And they were all subjects of King George up until about, 1776 was the Declaration of Independence. But around 1765, there was trouble brewing for Great Britain. The colonists were doing actually better. Citizens in the colonies were doing better than citizens in England generally. And England had just fought a number of wars with France, and they wanted to get some money out of the colonies to help pay for those wars. A lot of the wars were in North America. In fact, the French and Indian War started in 1854 and went about 10 years. So Britain was in debt. They tried to recover that money, and they had a variety of taxes, all of them unpopular, and it led to the rebellion of 1776. Now, the 13 colonies are here, and it started in 1776, ended in 1781. And then it took another 10 years in order for us to get the Constitution that we have. There was a lot of talking about what the Constitution should be, especially should there be a powerful executive or not. And ultimately they decided they wanted a powerful executive and they wanted taxation because the 13 colonies, one by one, couldn't stand against an England or a France or a Spain. There were a lot of dangers from big countries. So they decided it was best for them all to hang together. And also, they had to work together because King George III wasn't entirely happy with the situation. In fact, they had another war in 1812, called the War of 1812, where Britain tried to settle the scores. But at the end of the Revolutionary War, 1781, the U.S. got all of this land here, right down to New Orleans, almost to New Orleans. In 1803, we did the Louisiana Purchase, and that was at a time when France was heavily in debt, and that expanded our holdings for the U.S. into this area out here. France was getting out of the West. Napoleon needed money, so he sold the Louisiana territories to the U.S. for about $15 million. Then we had the War of 1812, where we settled the score with England. We got our border up here was set after that, and then the U.S. expansion continued. Texas was down here. The Texas territory, they were part of Mexico. And of course, Mexico owned all of this here. And Texas broke away from Mexico. And once again, the same old story. Texas alone was afraid of Mexico because Mexico was a very big country. They decided they wanted to be part of the United States because there was protection. And then the U.S. Took over Texas in 1845. About that same time, there was a war with Mexico. on this very subject. Mexico objected to the U.S. activities in their territory, and we fought a war. At the end of that war, this all became U.S. territory. Coincidentally, they struck gold in California about 1849, and they created a lot of people called the 49ers. There was a gold rush, and a lot of people came to California to become part of the gold rush. After the Mexican War, there was a little bit of land that wasn't settled. We bought that in what's called the Gadsden Purchase, and that filled out Arizona and New Mexico as we know it today. Then we went into a very tumultuous time in the Civil War. That lasted from 1861 to 1865. After the Civil War, the North won, of course. Northern politicians went down. They were called carpetbaggers and tried to run the South. They cooperated with some people in the South. They were called scallywags. But the time between 1865 through the 1870s, early 70s, the blacks were in control. They were the majority in a lot of cases, control of state legislatures and things like that. And then we had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s, and they eventually were able to stop the blacks from voting. The U.S. government was not willing to send federal troops down and occupy the South forever, so they cut their losses and said, okay, we're going to let the South govern itself, and that's what happened. And it was a very repressive situation if you were black, and I'm sure the whites weren't happy about it either. But they were, this situation went on from the 1870s right through, I'm going to say, 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed by Lyndon Johnson, a Southerner. And the South was not a comfortable place to live if you were black. There was tensions that would take place, and that resulted in a lot of people moving north. After the Civil War, the U.S. went ahead and purchased Alaska, which was considered to be Seward's folly. That was in 1867, right after the Civil War. We were afraid of the Russians coming in to North America and having a contest with the Russians. And we settled that by buying Alaska. About this time in the Pacific, Spain was having trouble with maintaining their colonies. They had lost the share of wars, and they still had Caribbean islands, Cuba in particular, and a lot of islands in the Pacific. Hawaii was still free. It had a lot of missionaries there, and over the years, Hawaii eventually decided to become part of the United States, largely for protection against the other major powers. And this was a pattern that occurred in the Pacific, where the peoples, indigenous peoples of these islands, had agreements with the U.S. So the U.S. could kind of protect them. So this is how we got into a lot of the islands in the Pacific. But the one event that was very significant was the Spanish-American War that took place in, I think it was 1898 and finished in 1899. And at that time, we beat Spain. And Spain had Cuba down here, and not Hawaii, but the Philippines over here, right next to Asia. The Philippine Islands were right next to Asia, a very strategic area. Japan was advancing at that time. They weren't entirely happy with us being over there. There wasn't a lot that they could do about it because we had a superior naval force In fact, in the late 1800s, I think you could say that the U.S. Military was the strongest in the world because it had grown during the Civil War. It was a very modern army at that point. So at the end of the Spanish-American War, Cuba was freed. This became a free country. Hawaii chose to come with the U.S. There was a lot of missionaries from the U.S. in Hawaii. They came with the U.S. too. So at the end of 1900, the Pacific, at least the northern Pacific, could be viewed as an American lake because we had the Philippines on the west side and, of course, California on the east side, and a variety of islands in between, including Hawaii. So that's the way it stood for several years, right up until about 1937, I think. In 1937, the United States cut off Japan from steel and oil, two commodities that were essential for waging war. And Japan was at war with China. They were an imperialist power, and they were expanding into China. And the United States decided that it was not in our interest to support the Japanese. And even though it was a depression, and we could use the money, we cut off all of the trade in munitions that could be used against China. Japan didn't like that, and they didn't like us being in the Pacific. They thought they could persuade us to leave by a sneak attack December 7th, 1941. And of course, everyone knows the result of that. It ended in nuclear bombs being dropped on Japan and the end of the World War II, where the U.S. had received unconditional surrender from the Japanese. And we owned the Japanese islands at that point. But we built them up, and at that time we also freed the Philippines. The Philippines had been occupied for 50 years, and we encouraged them to become their own country. We kept military bases over there. And then shortly after World War II, we redrew the lines, and one of the lines went through Korea and split Korea in half. China had just had a revolution in October 1st, 1949 was the beginning of a modern China under the rule of the Communist Party. And they objected to the U.S. having a position on the mainland of Asia. They encouraged North Korea to resist. There was an attack, and eventually the Chinese entered on behalf of the Koreans, North Koreans, and it was ultimately fought to a truce. So that's how we got into Asia. We still have a presence in South Korea. We still have a presence in Japan. Even though the Philippines asked us to leave in the late 1900s, they're encouraging us to come back again, largely for the same reason that the U.S. came together as 13 colonies, because on your own, in a world with superpowers, there's not much you can do when people come in and decide to take you over. So the Philippines are encouraging the U.S. to come back. And suddenly countries that were, as China begins its expansion, countries that maybe didn't want us over there are now starting to see the advantages of being friendly to the United States. Well, that's the end of the war discussion. We made a mistake by going to Vietnam thinking that we had to stop communism. Ultimately, we chose to leave. I don't think we lost that war because we could do anything we wanted when we were there. But we decided to cut our losses. We didn't know what the point was of that war. And history proves out China's turned into a capitalist country. So has Vietnam. And once again, like Vietnam, or like the 13 colonies, Vietnam doesn't want to be all alone with a superpower that's expanding. They've invited us. We've actually had the 7th Fleet sail into Haiphong Harbor, where a place that we bombed earlier, and now we're invited back. So that's a brief overview of the history of the U.S. Two points that need to be made. One was freeing the slaves. 1863, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and they were able to get a lot of countries around the world on the side of the North, because Lincoln made it clear the slaves were going to be freed if the North won. And the other significant event was, I think it was about 1918, when women got the right to vote. We actually freed the black men in 1863, and then they got the vote, and then the women actually were behind the blacks in getting their rights. But the blacks didn't have a lot of rights because where they were living was so repressive. That created basically a mass migration from the South, where there was very little economic opportunity and not a lot of political freedom, to the North, where they could get jobs in the cities. We needed labor because our cities were expanding, and they actually prospered in places like Harlem and Chicago, Detroit, even Los Angeles. Many of the cities prospered with the blacks moving in. And the reason it's important today is because the blacks were not welcomed in many cities. In fact, the whites often, now I've got to be careful here, I'm a real estate appraiser by profession, and appraisers aren't allowed to talk about race in appraisals, so I'm not engaged in the appraisal profession right now. I'm just talking about what I think happened in history. People were in fear for their life savings because most of them had their life savings in their homes. And when the blacks would move into the neighborhood, it was a race. Who can get out of the neighborhood first? If you were the first to sell before the prices started to fall, you were okay. But if you waited too long to sell, then maybe you couldn't sell. Maybe the price of your house went down so much and you would be stranded. So I'm not sure that it was racism so much as an economic incentive for people to sell out when blacks would move into the city. Now, I think we've covered the history pretty well, except for the plight of the cities. This year, in fact, as I speak, Detroit is engaged in a bankruptcy, the largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States. And Detroit is about 700,000, 82% black. And the suburbs surrounding Detroit are largely white, controlled by whites. Let's make a quick map of Michigan. There's the thumb, like that, and here's city of Detroit. It's a big area. And then this would be Flint and Ann Arbor over here. So all of this area, all of that area is suburban Detroit. All of the wealth of the region, and of course, Michigan was a very wealthy state when the auto industry was dominant. All of that wealth is surrounding the city of Detroit, but not so much in the city. The reason for that is whites moved out. And it's not necessarily bad for the blacks because they actually became the majority in the core cities. So 82% majority black gave them cities that they were in control of. They just didn't have any money. So right now, the laws in Michigan and in many of the other states of this country allow a cordoning off of the core city under one political ownership. I say ownership. This is Detroit here, and these are a variety of cities all around Detroit, and they all have their own governance. Even though they all use water, they all use sewer, they all use the same services, these businesses are separate businesses in each of these communities. You could have good water in one city and right next door bad water, just because of the history of those various utilities. Detroit Water Department actually split off from the city of Detroit and was able to serve a large part of that area. But for the most part, the fragmentation of the cities in the U.S., where you have people living together in an area together, but with a variety of cities and townships as the governing body, I believe that that situation is a direct result of trying to wall off the city to keep the problems present in a poor black community from spreading into the suburbs. And that's why I think that the Civil War, the race relations, the problems that we had with blacks largely, that was something that we're still suffering from. The laws in Michigan were designed to protect suburbs from the expansion of cities. Another one of my videos is the Michigan Townships Association director, Larry Merrill. And we talked a little bit about the political fragmentation, whether it was a good idea or not. He has some different ideas than I do. So I think that'll sum it up. The 2 points that I wanted to make is U.S. is a world power. In many ways, it just fell into our laps because we had a system of government that works. And Spanish could not sustain themselves. The French could not sustain themselves in this hemisphere. And a lot of the peoples of the world in the Pacific and in North America lined up with the United States thinking that's the best way to go. And so that's how the Pacific became essentially an American lake. And that's why I think the cities are in the position that they're in. Anyone looking at the bankruptcy of the city of Detroit might conclude that the U.S. is bankrupt because our greatest cities are in financial trouble. I don't believe that's true. The U.S. is still the strongest economy, twice the size of the largest countries that compete with us. And it's just the fact that these cities are so well known that it gives the impression that we're in more trouble than I think we really are. Thanks for watching.